Welcome to another episode of This Week in Crypto. My name is Singh, and this is the episode for May 13, 2018. In episode 17, we're going to talk to Cyrus Farivar, who wrote the book Habeas Data, Your Privacy versus the Rise of Surveillance Technology. Cyrus has been very influential in the tech sector. He is also a writer for Ars Technica. So, this is going to be one you guys are really going to want to listen to. All this in episode 17 in This Week in Crypto. First and foremost, I want to thank you for taking the time out and talking on the podcast here. I know you have a really busy schedule with all your tours going on for the book tour itself, and whatnot. So I do want to thank you because I think it's a very important topic. It's definitely something that our listeners need to be aware of, especially since they're in this whole realm of blockchain technology, and privacy is a huge thing.
Sure.
So before we get started, I was wondering if you could possibly tell us a bit about yourself, your background, your credentials, all that fun stuff for some of our listeners who haven't put two and two together. I know a lot of our listeners do listen or do read Ars Technica, but they may not know exactly who the authors are that are writing those great articles.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Cyrus Farivar. I am a senior tech policy reporter at Ars Technica. I've been with Ars for about 6 years now. Ars Technica is one of the oldest online-only tech publications. We've been around 20 years, which is way older than many of the others that are out there now. Ars Technica is a publication of Condé Nast, which is a very well-established media company out of New York City. Condé Nast also publishes the New Yorker magazine, Wired magazine, Vogue magazine, many other magazines that folks have heard of. But unlike all of those other publications that I just named, Ars has always been, and probably will always be, a digital-only publication. We have never been a print magazine. And also, unlike all of those other publications at Condé Nast, we have never had an office. Everybody at Ars works at home. I work from Oakland, California, where I live. But I have colleagues across the Bay in San Francisco, Seattle, Los Angeles, Houston, Austin, Chicago, DC, Baltimore, Boston, New York City, various places like that all over the country. I have another colleague in Denver, actually. So we're kind of spread out. We exist solely in email and Slack and the occasional, conference call. But that's how we function, and it's worked out for us for all these years.
Oh, wonderful. So what I really wanted to get into was this new book that just came out on May 8th, Habeas Data, Your Privacy in Today's Surveillance Technology. Could you tell us about that? What got you onto that topic, and how you kind of developed it into a book, as well as why it's so critical for our listeners to read this book and actually understand what's going on?
Yeah, so the book really is kind of a culmination of the last 5 or 6 years of my reporting at Ars. I mean, I began working on the book as a book only within the last year or so. But a lot of the stories and people and, my interest in the topic really originated several years ago. I arrived back in California in 2012, having just finished a 2-year job working and living in Germany, in Bonn, Germany, which is in the western part of the country near Cologne. I was working for the German international radio broadcaster Deutsche Welle, and I was working for their English language service. So Deutsche Welle is like the BBC World Service, but from Germany. So like the BBC World Service, Deutsche Welle has different language services. They have an English one, a Spanish one, a German one, a Russian one, Chinese, etc. And so I was working with the English service. So I had a weekly radio show that was in English, that was broadcast all over the world, about European science and technology news. And one of the first stories that I did when I first arrived in the spring of 2010 was about the arrival of Google Street View. Google Street View by that point had already been in the US for a few years. And, I think most of us, when we encountered Street View in the US, right, we didn't really think twice about it. I think most of us, it was kind of an oddity, a curiosity. We suddenly had this tool where we could show anybody, what our hometown street looks like and what our neighborhood looks like, what our communities look like. And that was pretty cool. And, other than maybe a few folks who maybe were a little bit concerned about it, it sort of went unnoticed. It's now part of the fabric of our internet, like anything else. In Germany, though, it was a little bit of a different story, right? A lot of people in the government were very uncomfortable that a foreign company had just unannounced, without asking permission, just rolled through the streets of Germany and took pictures of everybody's street and everybody's home in different cities. And a lot of people were really uncomfortable about that. And, and you had some folks that were saying that they were going to try to go after Google in some way. And there was a lot of kind of, as the Germans would say, Sturm und Drang, kind of back and forth sort of thing. And in the end, what happened was Google said, okay, we're going to take a very unusual step, and we're going to allow Germans to opt out of Google Street View. So right now, if you go on Google Street View in the U.S. and you look at people's faces or people's license plates, you'll see that they're blurred out, right? So in Germany, if you look at certain homes in the cities where Street View was available or is available, you'll see some homes and buildings and apartment buildings are blurred out as well. So Google created a special website. You could type in your name and address. You could say, I don't want to be on Street View, and they would do that. And I think largely as a result of the sort of cultural and political pressure, Google decided it wasn't going to update its images in Google Street View anymore. I don't think that any of the images have been updated since 2011. Compare that to the US, where I think in a lot of places the images are updated at least once a year, if not more often than that. So that really got me thinking about kind of what it means to be private and what privacy means to different people, and how, one thing in one place, can be sort of somewhat innocuous, like here in the US, while in Germany, a lot of people can have a very different feeling about it. And then as I returned back to my home state of California in 2012, I got to looking at what kinds of different technology were being used by law enforcement. And, of course, Edward Snowden, arrived on the public's mind in 2013. So I think that got, me and a lot of other people interested in privacy and in a whole new way. And, and we had a lot of new things that kind of entered our lexicon as a country, things like metadata, things like the FISA Accord, things like the Section 215 program, and lots of other things. And, and there were all kinds of new tools that became more easily available for people to use, encrypted messaging apps and things like that. So I started looking at, the different kinds of technologies that are currently in use by law enforcement across the country. And I was very surprised to learn, just to pick one of them, license plate readers, for example, which I read about in the book a lot, and I continue to report on today. This is a technology that I first learned about or first started, examining in 2012 and 2013. This is a specialized camera that is mounted on police cars, and these cameras can capture license plates at incredibly fast speeds, up to 60 plates per second. So that's an incredibly fast speed, right? That's far faster than any human or any team of humans could possibly do. And I was surprised to learn when I first started, hearing about this, that these license plate readers are not only in use in big cities in America, Chicago, Boston, Los Angeles, but as well as in the city where I live, Oakland, California. Right now, as I speak, they are mounted on more than 30 Oakland police cars. There's a smaller city that, if you look on a map, if you pull up the city of Piedmont, California, Piedmont, California. Piedmont, California is a tiny city of 12,000 people that is geographically surrounded by Oakland, right, which is a much larger city. Oakland's about 400,000 people. And Piedmont, is a very small, very rich city. It has almost no businesses in it. It's mostly residential. It has, its own schools and its own fire department, its own police department, and so forth. And the good people of Piedmont, in their infinite wisdom, have decided that, they don't trust the, riffraff like me from Oakland. So they've decided that they're going to put stationary license plate readers at nearly all of the border crossings with Oakland. So if you're driving from Piedmont into Oakland or vice versa, a Piedmont license plate reader is going to scan your car, and there's not much you can do about it. So I started to look into how these technologies work, what they are, how common they are, and also what are the rules that govern them, right? What are the laws and authorities and regulations, if any, that govern them. And what is the what does case law have to say about this kind of thing? What does the Supreme Court have to say about this kind of thing? So really what the book is about is examining 10, I would argue, 10 cases that have had the biggest impact over surveillance in America over the last 50 years, and helping people understand how those cases, even if they may date back to 1967 or the 1970s or 1980s, and even more recent ones, how they apply to the circumstances in which we find ourselves today.
That's really interesting, especially since you were just speaking about Google as well. There's so much data that we give up on a day-to-day basis that we don't even understand we're giving up. We take things for granted, like would rather carry my credit card than any amount of cash, but because it's convenient. But what I'm not really understanding when I'm swiping that card is how much information I'm giving up of where I am, what I'm purchasing. And it's not just private companies. I guess, as you alluded to the book, that governments are tapping into this data. There was actually one chapter, the first chapter, that was talking about cell phones that really caught my attention. If you want to dive into that.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is something that is kind of interesting. And my experience in Germany, one of the things I took away from my experience in Germany is that I came to the conclusion that, in general, not everybody, but in general, I would say most Europeans and certainly most Germans, their kind of default position is they trust their own government more than they trust private companies, right? And I think Google is a good example of that, right? Had the German government been, the one driving cars all over Germany and, creating its own Street View or Street View-like product, I think there would have been a little bit more trust there. But because it was a private company, and particularly a foreign private company, Google, I think there was a little bit more skepticism there. I feel like in the US, our default position is generally the opposite. We're generally pretty trusting of private companies, right? I mean, it was only very, very recently was dragged before the US Senate to submit himself to 10 hours of questioning. And Facebook has been around for a long time, for almost 20 years now. And as far as I know, that's the first time that Zuckerberg has ever been asked to testify before Congress. But we have sort of an inherent distrust of government, right? Our whole American story, the American Revolution, is based on distrust of a foreign power, the King of England, that was, exercising arbitrary power over us. And we created a whole constitution that describes how the government should be and what rights the people have and what things the government can and cannot do. If you think about what the Bill of Rights says, collectively, right, like Congress shall make no law, the rights shall not be infringed, right? It describes clearly, it sets up limits for what the government itself can do. So we sort of have an inherent kind of distrust of government, I think, in general in America. But so, yeah, as you were talking about with the phones, so the first case that I write about in the book is a case that dates back to the 60s, to the mid 60s, and it's a case that in the Supreme Court is known as Katz versus United States. So Charles Katz was a gambler living in Los Angeles. He was a middle-aged dude. He made his living betting on mostly college basketball and other sporting events. And of course, there in most parts of America, certainly interstate gambling is illegal, right? You can't just gamble, just willy-nilly. There are certain places in America where it's allowed, Vegas, Reno, Atlantic City, places like that. So this guy, he was walking around and he would go to certain payphones, and he would call his bookies in the East Coast and he would make bets. And the police and the FBI started getting turned on to him in 1964, 1965. And they eventually figured out by watching his movements that he preferred to go to a certain bank of phone booths on Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood, right across the street from the Chateau Marmont Hotel, which is sort of a famous hotel that still stands in Hollywood in Los Angeles right now. The phone booths, as far as I know, are long gone, but you can go to that hotel now. So he liked to go walk over there, use these phone booths, and the authorities decided that the way that they were going to try to catch him in the act was to mount some microphones and a recording device on top of the phone booths that he liked to use. And it's important to remember, right, this is 1960s era technology. So I'm imagining we don't unfortunately have pictures of what this kind of setup looked like, but what I imagine is kind of a real, like a reel-to-reel tape recorder, pretty large thing, probably a kind of a bulky microphone. And if you think about it, right, the roof of a phone booth is basically the only place that you could put it without it being noticed, because it would be probably such a bulky item. But anyway, so they had this thing, they rigged it up on top of the phone booths. They had a guy that would, they would watch him walk a few blocks away from his apartment to walk over to use the phone booth. And one of the agents would climb up the phone booth really fast, turn on the recorder, and run away so that he wasn't seen. And they did this for over the course of 6 days. They watched him. The police even they rented a room next door to his. They could hear him outside as he spoke on the phone from his room as well. And then they watched him as he walked down the street to use the payphones.
Now, just a quick question.
Yeah.
Did they need a warrant for that?
So it's a good question. Yeah. So the police at that time believed that they did not need a warrant. So the prior Supreme Court precedent governing this sort of thing dated back to the 1920s, to the Prohibition era in America. There was a case called U.S. versus Olmstead. So Olmstead was a former Seattle police officer turned bootlegger. He was running liquor all over the place, and in that case, the police wiretapped him without a warrant. Again, believing that they did not need one. There was no law governing the use of wiretaps at the time. So in the Olmstead case, this is the 20s Prohibition case. In the end, the Chief Justice Taft, writing for the majority of the court, said there was no searching, there was no seizure. Basically saying, what was captured was sound traversing a wire that didn't even penetrate, this guy's property, this guy Olmstead's property, right? It was captured. It was sort of ethereal sounds, captured on a wire. So that does not violate, in his view, and the majority of the court's view, the spirit of the Fourth Amendment. And so this took a very kind of narrow view of the Fourth Amendment, saying, look, what's important here is a physical trespass of somebody's property that would constitute a Fourth Amendment violation. So that was the kind of prevailing view from the 20s and on into the mid-60s. And so by the time we get to Charles Katz on Sunset Boulevard with the phone booths, this is what the police believe the legal standard is, right? So that's why they put the microphones not inside the phone booth, but rather on top of the phone booth, because they haven't physically penetrated the airspace of the phone booth itself, right? So they do this. They don't have a warrant. They don't think they need one, and so they rig up this whole system. They record him for 6 days. They catch him, calling his bookies numerous times. They arrest him at the phone booth finally. They do have a warrant to search his apartment. He's polite when he's arrested. He does not resist. He gets walked down to his apartment. They find all kinds of betting materials, papers, rolls of quarters, all kinds of things. And he's prosecuted for gambling. And he goes through a 2-day bench trial. He's convicted. He appeals. He loses the appeal. Eventually, the case reaches the Supreme Court. And the question that the court is being asked to deal with is, was it a violation of the Fourth Amendment? Was it an unreasonable search when the police put microphones on top of the phone booth and recorded him inside the phone booth without a warrant? And ultimately, the answer to that question was, yes, that was a violation. And this established for the first time a legal standard that we now have, that we now live with today. This phrase that maybe some folks have heard of, a, quote, reasonable expectation of privacy. So Mr. Katz in the phone booth on Sunset Boulevard did have a reasonable expectation of privacy when he stepped into that phone booth, in the same way that he would have a reasonable expectation of privacy at home or in his office or in a hotel room or in a taxi or in a few other places where, if the government wants to surveil you, in most circumstances, they do need a warrant to do so.
So when you speak of privacy, a reasonable amount of privacy, I guess, how does that pertain to now, when every bit of our information, such as our location on our cell phones, is either always turned on, or even when it's turned off, law enforcement, government, and even these private companies can get to where we are, where we're traveling, how we're going. I mean, just by using Google Maps, you can create a layout of where someone's been within a year or multiple years span of time.
Sure, and that's a good point, right? So it's important to remember that, in America, this reasonable expectation of privacy that I talked about, that's different than a right to privacy, right? We don't have a right to privacy in the same way as exists in the European Union and perhaps other places as well. And it's important to remember also that the U.S. Constitution protects us, the Fourth Amendment specifically protects us against government's actions against us, right? The Fourth Amendment and the Constitution have nothing to say about what Facebook or Google or Twitter or any other company can do. It has nothing to say about what citizens could do against each other, right? That the Fourth Amendment specifically protects citizens against the actions of government. And it doesn't protect against all searches and seizures. It specifically protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. That is the language that is in the Constitution right now. And that is the language that we've lived with in this country for over 200 years. And so what exactly is reasonable? What is not reasonable? What is a search? It turns out is a matter of some debate, right? So it turns out, there are some sort of well understood searches, right? If the police kick down your door and start ransacking your dresser and opening your file cabinets, that is a search. But there's a lot of things that are not searches and therefore don't even touch the Fourth Amendment, right? So I was talking about license plate readers a moment ago. The police argue and the government argues that the capturing of your license plate by a machine is not a search because the license plate by definition is viewable in public. That's what license plates are. So they're not searching anything. They're not invading somewhere that's hidden, right? They're simply capturing what is already known, what is already visible, even if they're doing it at an incredible speed, right? So that's one of the ways that there's this kind of, I think, to many non-lawyers, myself included, there's this sort of strange distinction between what is a search, what is not a search, what is content and what is non-content, what we might call metadata, right? You can learn an awful lot about somebody simply by looking at, for example, their call records, right? Even if I'm not listening to your voice as you call, your friends or your loved ones or your business colleagues, I can learn an awful lot if I know the numbers that you're calling, what time of day you're calling, how long you're on the phone for, right? This is exactly what the NSA's metadata program is predicated on. It's predicated on not listening in on people's voices, but rather gathering all of the metadata on all of us in the United States in the name of fighting terrorism by finding out who called who, when, and for how long.
It's really interesting, especially considering the fact that almost every home now has like an Alexa or a Google Home of some sort, where the possibility of someone or some entity or some private company to listen in to our private conversations, it's there. It's a reality at this point, almost a 1984 Orwellian society that we don't really can understand.
It's true. It's true. And I do wonder how products like the Alexa, I do wonder how they will do commercially in countries like Germany that I think traditionally have had a very different kind of cultural vibe. I don't even know if the Alexa is available for sale in Germany. Maybe it is. I'm not sure. But, I would be really curious to find out, how well they do. Certainly in many homes, I've been to people's homes here in the Bay Area where people have things like the Alexa. But, it's already happened where, the Alexa, literally that particular product, right, has been part of a criminal investigation. There was a case out of Arkansas not too long ago, I think it was last year, where an Alexa was present at the scene of a murder. And the police wanted to gain access to the data that the Alexa captured in the hopes of solving a murder. And you can imagine why that would be useful to the police, right? If the Alexa, by the way that it is designed, it is listening all the time, right? It has to know when to respond to people's voice commands. So in order to do that, it has to be listening and capturing audio data all the time. And some people may find a lot of utility out of that kind of product, but it also means that it opens up another avenue for the government to get access to that data.
Right, and it seems like there's always been a struggle, at least in the United States, correct me if I'm wrong, about struggle between personal privacy and governmental control. Obviously, it's to their advantage to have the control because they want to conduct society in a certain manner. But privacy is something that the everyday mom and pop, the everyday Joe holds very, very sacred. And it's funny how in these days it's been kind of framed with the intent of national security versus privacy. And we kind of see that with the whole cell phones. When you cross over the border, sometimes they do a cell phone check. And if I remember correctly from my con law class, they can't ask you for the numbers that are in your head, but they can definitely require you to put your fingerprint if you have a fingerprint swipe to get into your phone so they can search, would be the word to put it, your phone before you enter.
Yeah, no, that's true. And right, so the Fourth Amendment, a lot of people don't know this. People who've maybe studied the law or maybe read my articles on Ars Technica or have other familiarity with this area of the law might already know. But I think a lot of us don't realize, I certainly didn't until I started reporting on this a few years ago, is that one of the exceptions to the Fourth Amendment is, as you say, at the border, right? There's this so-called border exception idea that no warrant is needed to search somebody's phone or to search somebody's bag, right? You have to, if you've ever crossed the U.S. border, I'm sure a lot of us have had the experience of being forced to open up our bag or have it be searched by border agents before. But yeah, so that's a very interesting question. And, now that under the Trump administration, for whatever reason, we don't know why, CPB has not said, the Customs and Border Protection has not said why, but there have been significant uptick of searches of digital devices at the border in very recent months. And, in fact, there was just a court case this past week in the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals that said that, border agents cannot simply search somebody's digital device without reasonable suspicion, right? They can't just do it just because they're invoking the border exception because, and this is another Supreme Court case that I read about, there's a recent case called Riley versus California that involves a suspected gang member in San Diego who, while he was being arrested, had his phone searched without a warrant, because at that time the standard was that police treated searching a cell phone like they would treat searching your wallet. And when it got up to the Supreme Court said no in a resounding 9-0 decision. They said that analogy makes no sense. And Chief Justice John Roberts, in the writing for the court, said, to make that comparison is like saying that a ride on horseback is the same thing as a flight to the moon. They both get you from place to place, but they're entirely different things and they're entirely different scales. So we can't do that. So that Fourth Circuit decision that just happened this past week, that obviously only applies to one part of the country. We don't yet have a national standard in that respect. And, I know the ACLU and other activist groups are really trying to fight this because, all of us, I think, travel with digital devices, smartphones, and other things with us as we come in and out of the U.S. And, we would like to believe that if the government does, if they want to search our smartphones or whatever, that they should have a very good reason to do it. And they should have to go through a warrant standard just as they would if they wanted to search, a phone, seized at my house.
So I do remember reading something in some news blurb about that. But what I don't remember was if they had defined what reasonable suspicion was in that case.
I don't know that they had defined it in that particular case. I think that if I remember correctly, what the Fourth Circuit ruled was that because the Fourth Circuit knew that it was creating essentially a new rule, essentially overturning that border exception, that they weren't going to sort of retroactively apply it in that particular case. But they were saying that, going forward, that was what they were going to do. And, again, we don't know, how other courts will come down on this issue. But I think it's, and I know there's efforts right now in Congress to pass federal legislation that would say, okay, if you're going to search somebody's phone, you do have to have a reasonable suspicion. I mean, that's a well-trodden, legal standard. There's I don't have the definition in front of me, but that's a one of those things like probable cause, where, reasonable suspicion is one of those things where police officers know what that means, right? Government lawyers know what that means. There's very clear case law as to how to define that.
Interesting. And I'm actually going to switch a little bit over here.
Sure.
I know you wrote an article on the Silk Road and Bitcoin, which actually won you an award in 2016. I remember reading that article. I guess since we are, this week in crypto, I have to bring in crypto somehow. So maybe this is why governments are kind of fearing this blockchain technology, because it's an open ledger, right? So now everything they do, if they're using blockchain, would mean that it's transparent. And that's something that from time and time again, we've seen that governments don't want necessarily want transparency. Transparency in the sense of like, how they're conducting things, how they're conducting surveillance and whatnot, because they want to work under the radar. We, as everyday citizens, don't really truly know exactly the in and outs of what's going on. And when blockchain is implemented into government societies, and I'm not just talking about cryptocurrencies or currency related, even though if we look at the financial sector, even they're a little fearful about that because using blockchain, everything becomes transparent, right? Where money's going, how things are being done becomes transparent. And transparency can lead to a slippery slope, especially if something or someone or some nation is doing something that isn't in tune with human rights or something like that. And we've seen that time and time in our own government. Maybe that's why there's such a huge resistance to this new technology.
I'm just trying to understand, when you say resistance, like resistance in the public, resistance by the government? I mean, Bitcoin and every other cryptocurrency is, they're legal, right? They have to, they exist and but at the same time, they are subject, at least in the U.S., to, money laundering rules and various other kinds of financial regulations. And the SEC and the Treasury Department have shown that they're not going to tolerate, people using them for criminal behavior, right? And they've, but just because you and I, are using our Bitcoin to settle our own private debts, I don't think that violates any laws.
Right. And it doesn't, but we can see in Japan how they're trying to get anonymity coins out of the market, getting rid of Monero, getting rid of Zcash and whatnot, while Illinois and other states are starting to implement this blockchain technology because of the smart contracts concept of it. And one of the issues when you have something of this sort is that as we increase in technology, we're giving up on our privacy. And so I believe MIT, there's a group at MIT that's doing some research on the Enigma project on how to create a private blockchain for stuff like birth records and whatnot. But it's kind of interesting how certain governments, maybe not completely in the U.S., but in other parts of the world, that are kind of resistant to this change because they don't want everyone to know what's going on, what they're doing, or where, how they might be violating their own rules and regulations. But that's a whole different Pandora's box that I really don't want to open up at this point. But what I wanted to get to was how surveillance, I guess, as technology increases, we tend to lose what we call privacy. And to what extent are we losing it?
I mean, it depends on what I would say all of that depends on what you mean by privacy, and privacy from whom or what, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you live in a house or an apartment, I would bet that you, like me, have curtains or blinds or drapes on your windows, right? So you are private to an extent from at least regular humans walking by your house that they won't be able to see inside, right? You probably have locks on your door. You are private to, in a sense, at least physically. Are you private when you go online, right? We all know that there are tools that try to make your actions more private, more anonymous, things like Tor, VPNs, and other tools that are out there. There are also encrypted messaging apps, right, that you can use that make it much more difficult, not impossible, but much more difficult for records of your conversations to be captured and recorded. So, I think that, privacy is one of those things that is very difficult, right? It's difficult for companies. It's difficult for individuals. It's difficult to maintain certainly perfect privacy. But yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, right, even if you're somebody who cares about privacy when you're online and you do take all of these steps, let's say you're talking about Bitcoin or cryptocurrency or whatever, and maybe you don't want your friends or your neighbors or your employer to know who you are, right? A lot of people use anonymous handles, right, on Bitcoin Talk and other websites, right? So to stay private for that reason. A lot of people choose not to publish a lot of personal details about themselves, pictures of themselves, of their family, their address, right? I think a lot of us do have a sense of what should be private, what is private, and take steps to try to make sure that that is the case, right? The fact that we have an entire word for the weaponization of private information, doxing, shows that, to me, that there is the possibility of having some information remain private at least some of the time. Sure, I think it's very difficult to exist in the modern world and have a cell phone and use the internet and have a credit card and live in a house or an apartment and participate in kind of modern global society totally anonymously, where nobody knows who you are and nobody knows what you're doing. You'd have to be using burner phones every hour basically to or something like really crazy like that. I think that for most people that is extremely difficult, if not outright impossible. But I agree with you. There's, I think, reasons to be concerned about potential invasions of our privacy, whether it's from private companies or whether from the government.
It's funny because those people that do stand up and actually talk about privacy, the first rebuttal they get or the first pushback they get is, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, why do you care?
Yeah, and to that I would say what I just said a moment ago, which is, number one, I have never met anybody who has said that to me, who has willingly given me a key to their house or the password to their email or, taken all the blinds off of their windows. I think that we all of us engage in normal, lawful behavior that we, at least in some sense, would like to keep private, whether it's activities that we engage in the privacy of our own home, whether it's things that we engage in when we're out in public, right? Whether we go to a gun store or a marijuana clinic or a religious, attend church or a mosque or a temple or other type of religious service, whether we go to see a doctor, whether we go to an abortion clinic, whether we go to a sex toy shop or a strip club or, or even just something as basic as, we ditched our job on a Wednesday afternoon so we could go to a baseball game, right? There's lots of things that we all do that we might not necessarily want there to be kind of a permanent record of.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you could do us all a favor here and let us know where we can pick up your book.
Sure. Yeah. So, I would urge folks to support their local bookstore. So if your local bookstore, doesn't have it, your favorite bookstore, you can check out my website, habeasdatabook.com. That's HABEAS, habeas data, DATA book, spelled normally BOOK.com. There's links to buying it on Amazon, Powell's Books in Portland, lots of other places. But yeah, most local bookstores should carry it, but otherwise feel free to order it through your favorite book retailer of choice.
Definitely an interesting read, something that I've started and I can't put down. So I do plan on finishing it by the end of the week, and a topic that I think everybody should actually, get a handle on or at least dive into, because we're all affected by it one way or another.
Sure, we're all affected by it, and I think that, there's starting to be sort of a realization for the first time amongst lawmakers and activists and other people that are concerned about these issues. As I said, I live in Oakland, and just literally last week, in early May, the city of Oakland passed for the first time a new ordinance that establishes meaningful community oversight over surveillance technology, things like license plate readers, drones, body cameras, stingrays, cell site simulators that we didn't even talk about. But, and any other future, potentially privacy invasive technology that the city might want to use for legitimate law enforcement reasons, right? But what Oakland and many other cities are doing, Berkeley, California, Davis, California, I know other cities as well are looking into these things, trying to better understand and get a handle on, how these technologies are being used and how to make them effective tools for law enforcement while also protecting our civil rights and civil liberties. And I think that that is a very difficult balance. And it's incumbent upon all of us in our own communities, in our own backyards, to try to work with our policymakers and, try to really have a good faith dialogue and a good faith discussion as to how to get this, answer to this question right.
Being the inquisitive person I am, I'm going to have to go back, rewind a little bit here and say stingrays.
Sure. So stingrays, so I should just say up top, so stingrays are the sort of trademarked specific term that have come to mean the generic technology, right? So just like how Xerox, we say Xerox to mean kind of generic photocopying, or we say Kleenex to mean kind of generic, facial tissues. So stingrays, the generic term is a cell site simulator. It's essentially a fake cell phone tower, right? So it's a device that is in use, again, where I live in Oakland and probably in most cities in America, that acts as a fixed tower. It does so by broadcasting a strong cell signal And all of our phones are by design designed to latch on to the strongest cell signal that they see. All of our phones are designed to capture the strongest cell signal available, right? We all want there to be better cell service. And so what these devices do is they broadcast a fake signal, essentially blanketing out all the others, and they force phones in a certain area to connect to those towers, or to this fake tower, as it were. And what the effect of that is your phone essentially gives up its location to this fake tower. So that means that the police can use your own phone against you as a tracking device. And this is something that has been in use by law enforcement for years, often with relatively little judicial oversight, and only within the last few years have, at the federal level, the Department of Justice, the Homeland Security, said that they are going to require a warrant in most cases to use a stingray when going after a particular suspect. Some states, including my home state of California, have again, relatively new state laws that also require a warrant, but a lot of places don't. And that policy, policy by DOJ and DHS is just a policy, right? It's not a law. It's not a law passed by Congress and signed by the president. It could be rescinded at any time. So this is a technology that's in use right now, and is, I think, largely unknown by most of us out here.
That's very interesting, and another thing that's really interesting is how laws, or how the Bill of Rights from back when are evolving. How the Constitution is an evolving document, and how it's we can see the evolution in our law and technology law as it manifests, or as it gets created on a day-to-day basis today.
Sure. I mean, I think all of that depends on sort of your definition of the Constitution. I think generally a lot of folks on the conservative side of the political ledger would say, that the Constitution, means what it says. And so when we talk about certain things, they have, right, there's this idea amongst judicial thinking of what's often called textualism, right? Justice Scalia was a big proponent of this idea that when you talk about interpreting the Constitution, you should think about the plain meaning of the words as they were written at the time. People on the more liberal side of the spectrum, more progressive, might say, I think what you just said, which is that the Constitution is an evolving document, and we cannot be limited to simply what it said at the time, because, if we did, then we would have ideas that were held in the Constitution as it was written at the time that I think to us today would not be acceptable, right? The Constitution validated, or didn't speak to, right, things like slavery. Women were not given the right to vote. African Americans were considered as 3/5 of a person. These types of ideas are anathema to us today. They're totally unacceptable. And I recognize that maybe not everybody who might view them as a judicial conservative would say that we should bring back slavery. Of course not. But I think that there's just a matter of debate, right? This is what our judicial system is all about. It's trying to solve these questions and trying to figure out what all of these things mean today.
Cyrus, thank you so much for taking the time out to come talk to us about your book. And guys out there, if you're listening, definitely a book to pick up, definitely something to put on your Goodreads, Habeas Data, Privacy versus the Rise of Surveillance Technology.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks again for having me on the show. I would encourage folks, again, to go to habeasdatabook.com to check out not only the book itself, but also to check out some opportunities where I'll be speaking around the country in May and June. And later on throughout the year, I've got dates, a lot of dates here in California. I'm also going to be speaking at an event at Black Hat in Las Vegas in August. So if you're going to be at Black Hat, I'll be there speaking on August the 7th. I will also be in Washington, D.C. and Baltimore in June. It's looking like I'm going to be in Dallas and maybe other places in Texas in October. But if you live somewhere around the U.S. and you'd like me to come speak to your group or university or club or whatever, please drop me a line. I'm always open to such invitations.
Do you have a Twitter handle where people can follow you at, or?
Yeah. I'm pretty active on Twitter. My Twitter handle is pretty easy. It's my first initial C, and followed by my last name, Farivar, F-A-R-I-V-A-R. So taken together, that's C-F-A-R-I-V-A-R.
Thank you once again.
All right, guys. We hope you enjoyed that interview. And we want to thank Cyrus for coming on the show
educating us and talking to us about surveillance, privacy, and all that good stuff. If you like what you hear, you can follow us on iTunes, Radio Public, Overcast, and a few other syndications out there. Now, if you have a podcatcher or you get your podcast any other way, just type in This Week in Crypto and we will show up. If you guys are already subscribed, leave us a rating. That really helps us out. And if you're on Facebook, join us there. Twitter, you can join us there as well, @_CryptoCoin Group. And obviously, if you guys are listening to us through YouTube, subscribe. If you're already subscribed, hit that tiny bell so you get all of our updates as soon as we publish them. And give us that thumbs up. If you're an author or an ICO that's looking at talking about your crypto asset, don't hesitate. Give us a call. Contact us. We'd love to have you on the show. The more we get to learn, the better we are as investors. So again, give us a holler over at the contact button on our website, or tweet us, or send us a Facebook message, and we will get back to you. We'd love to have you on our show. Other than that, guys, we hope you enjoyed this show. And until next week, this is Singh with Crypto Coin Guru signing out. This is episode 17 in the can.